All right, folks. Thanks for coming to find the warmth of our sun. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Masson 365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts. Yeah. Thanks for coming, folks. How was it? Yeah, it's been an interesting couple weeks for me. I suppose for all of us. Been a little bit outside of vacation, on focus on other things, or just in general. I was rolling around the idea of doing a bit on the Tulsa Race Massacre and not just focusing on that, but the over 100 other known massacres in black neighborhoods, destroying and looting black wealth, killing, beating, maiming black people, men, women, children. Many of them were state supported, and when I mean that by police officers and such, and like the Tulsa massacre, the Army Air Corps was there, and also Tulsa was a bit more organized than we think. It wasn't just a white mob going in. There's some planning involved in this, and almost seen as retribution for black people daring to build wealth. And that isn't something alone in Tulsa either. The daring of building wealth, of building social enterprise and social power and voting were things that often were the triggers of these massacres. Yeah, and this is on top of the 6,000 known lynchings, and before, and that's not even really counting the highways and bypasses built throughout black neighborhoods in the 50s and 60s and 70s, along with urban renewal or so-called urban renewal projects that displaced that follow along with these lines and replaced black businesses and small businesses with malls and white wealth building projects, displacing thousands upon thousands of black families and black businesses never able to be seen again or recover. This is on top of black families and people being left out of land grants and land colleges and other farming grants and federal housing authority grants, the GI Bill, banks illegally not lending to black families, which continues to this day, redlining, cop killings, the rise of mass incarceration. I don't know, some days you get left with not being focused, because it's all there, it's all big, and even myself, I get overwhelmed by it sometimes, even though I'm a big picture thinker who sees the forest and sometimes misses the trees for the forest. History is overwhelming. American history is overwhelming. And really, it's a history of white violence. It's what it is. If that makes you angry, upset, wanting to throw a brick through the window, think about why. I mean, think about our U.S. history and how it's not a history of white violence. We have white conservatives with their weird mix of delusional people thinking none of this is as bad as it sounds, that stuff's largely made up, and they blame the Democrats because Democrats were the conservative party long ago, or the party of white racial grievances party, and things evolve, change over time. Then you have the bad faith actors, and all of them believe that the current state of black America is really black America's fault and are on the Democratic plantation, unable or unwilling to work through working definitions of CRT, socialism, cancel culture, wokeness, and use these things as sledgehammers of white grievance politics. Words that including myself, we've been caught up in trying to either defend or talk about or engage with without even working definitions, or at least agreed upon working definitions, because these things do have working definitions. It's just that the right doesn't care about them, and in fact, a lot of white people really don't care about them just in general across political spectrum. And folks want to engage with this stuff without critical thought. And walk lockstep behind them, echoing the exact same words and racist arguments, stuff that you look back and read history of what people wrote is echoed throughout, and quite frankly really is any different than stuff you've read about, or you can read about whites talking about abolition or civil rights before after that. Before us, I should say. Of these types of words and accusations against those fighting for black liberation. Nothing's changed. The rhetoric's the same. Doesn't even just rhyme. It's sometimes word for word, almost the exact same thing. And then we have the white moderates who give cover to these folks and attempt to talk about equal parallels of white nationalists and leftists. And when they mean leftists, they really only mean those that support anti-racism efforts and black liberation, because a lot of times they'll exclude those that talk in purely colorblind economic terms as being leftists, attempting to brand both as authoritarianism because of scary cancel culture and not wanting racists to have control. Well, one is purely just one side is actually fighting to expand democracy and voting rights and so on and so forth. The other is so much against it. And these folks talk as if they're the only truly people of objectiveness, I should say the moderates. They're the only true non-ideological voices. As if supporting empire isn't radical, as if supporting a nation state with the expansive poverty along with obscene wealth isn't somehow radical, as if nation building upon genocide and chattel slavery isn't radical, as if Jim Crow and more obscure segregation and anti-black violence that we've seen in the North isn't radical. People who support the status quo as moderates will still believe much of what is so-called wrong with Black America's fault, who throw small snippets of MLK quotes or some other black radical who they read just a little bit about, of a little line, a little quote they saw that they agreed with, which means then, of course, this black radical agrees with this moderate, that this moderate's position is correct because this out of context quote is somehow encapsulates what this white moderate believes. So of course it's right, without actually engaging with this black radical's thought, particularly MLK, who, if they actually engage with the thought, would find a lot of things that they very much disagree with, that they actually also dismiss of our current Black Lives Matter movement. Echoes of that. And say MLK would disparage this movement and so on and so forth. And they work to uphold the white supremacist status quo. But they also believe in equal rights, so how can they be racist? As if most racists even admitted that they were racist, or even admitted to themselves that they were racist. Most racists don't actually consciously believe they're racist. That's part of what makes them racist. They boil it down to individual levels of racism as if the N-word is not being said or a cross isn't being burned. Then it's not racist, or it's questionable. They deny how pervasive institutional and structural racism is as they drive along interstates and highways that were once centers of black families and black neighborhoods. And then we have white liberals who will paint Black Lives Matter signs or plant Black Lives Matter signs on the yard, yet support policies or will vote against housing measures, will vote to expand police budgets and to expand jails, to do anything except tackle structural issues at hand, but they can't be racist because they believe Black Lives Matter. The same people believe being poor is the same as being black, equating the two, but don't see the problem because black people are disproportionately poor and can't tell the difference between these two statements. And frankly, too tired to point out the obvious differences between black people are disproportionately a lower income to black people equals poor. While continuing to vote against measures that help keep black people poor, who don't support measures that attack these disparities, but also who fail to see racism cuts across class lines. And kind of through it all, I thought of something Toni Morrison said of the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And that's what we keep doing. We almost have to keep doing it because it keeps us distracted from the work. Heck, even the work of liberation, because we have to defend our being, be it from police encounters or social work or scholarly our scholarly work, defending our life and livelihoods, our histories, our ideas, and more. And really all this to say, sometimes you really don't have a lesson or something you can focus on or deeper thoughts because it's just all there. It's just there. And kind of tired today. It's just, you kind of feel that you're repeating yourself ad nauseum. And in a lot of ways, we really are rehashing the same arguments and conversations, ones that have been happening every generation since 1619. I mean, for real, like, read the arguments of abolitionists and of enslavers, and it's the same argument. Same arguments. Black liberation, philosophers of sorts, and then writers and academics. Seems we're caught in some sort of Groundhog Day in this country. Slavery, anti-blackness, white supremacy, and racism have been present in what we now call the United States longer than the United States has even been in existence, longer than there's been a constitution. Yet there's people across the aisles, particularly white people, that feel that racism, white supremacy, and slavery are less important to the foundations of this country than a document in the Constitution of the United States and some of the ideas behind the document that was, mind you, created by mostly slave-owning white men. And within it codifies the property status of black people with the 3/5 clause. That's what it does. And somehow they would rather focus that these slave-owning white men's ideas of freedom and liberty are more essential and more important to this nation than slavery, anti-blackness, white supremacy, and genocide, even though it's built within the Constitution. Our property-owning white men could vote. The 3/5 clause codified black slaves as property into the Constitution. The Second Amendment was brought about more to keeping black people in bondage than anything else, because many of these slave states were very threatened by black uprisings. They had to find a way and to arm their populace to help push back against black uprisings. Some states, particularly at that point in history, had more black people enslaved than they had white people living there. So of course I had to keep them in order. Most of these men, or many of these men, I don't know, most, knew the horror that slavery was, or chattel slavery was. They justified it as a necessary evil. By saying we can't judge them by today's standards, well, we ignore the voices and the cries of those that they enslaved, who also knew what was going on was wrong. The only way we can't judge these men in our time is by dismissing the voices of those they brutally enslaved, by ignoring those voices, by not seeing those enslaved as valued or valid voices of their own liberation. We also ignore how many of these men loved the power and dominance of the ability to inflict violence without consequence upon a people. Many of these same men have buildings, roads, and more named after them, and many aren't even Confederates. So I'm not entirely sure how to end this one, and probably kind of trail off a little bit into it. Kind of more speaking into the ether today of thoughts and ideas that I don't know, that I have to get off my chest once in a while as I sit unfocused on a specific story to tell or idea to explore. Wanting to hold a mirror to this country, particularly this country's white populace. The violence of white America is real, and it runs deep. And there's a specific type of irony of this country, and particularly white people, telling others to be peaceful in the face of white violence and state violence. It's a dark comedy. It really is. And even in this, like I was saying, there's many white liberal people who claim to be for racial justice, who recoil at the idea of such a widespread or generalized statement that I'm kind of making here. These same people ignore most white people stand on the side of fascism today. How most white people, all white people, have benefited from such racism and most stood idly by through this nation's history, as many others actively acted to uphold these things as violence was taking place. Their home in a new suburb that was made possible by violence. Many chose not to think about these things or learn about these things and recoil about learning about these things. The reality is really only a minority of whites has stood ideologically on the side of justice. And even a smaller have actively fought for justice. And even a smaller percentage understood and were willing to give up the cost of liberty for all. And were willing to pay that price. People might think of the Civil War, but shoot, there were entire race riots in New York by Irish immigrants who did not want to fight for the Union, or I should say for the United States, because they saw it as a cause for black people. It needs to say that the United States didn't fight the Civil War to free black people, to end slavery. Lincoln would do whatever he needed to do to preserve the Union. And if that meant keeping slavery going, he would have done that. It just so happened that political and war necessities pushed the United States into abolishing slavery, partially so because of the 13th Amendment, still allows state slavery in the context of mass incarceration. And the South did fight it for slavery, but to preserve it, not to preserve the Union in such a way. They also felt that ideologically, slavery and the existence of slavery was the true American way. And we see that mentality still pervasive today in a lot of ways. The fight for black liberation has almost entirely been a fight by black people. And if you're white and recoil at this broad statement about white people and thinking about this is a generalization, so it can't be true, then provide evidence that counters the well-documented evidence that most white people oppose black liberation movements throughout U.S. history. And even now, there's a small window, the summer of 2020, where most white people supported Black Lives Matter. Now, most white people don't support Black Lives Matter. But that was the first time in history where white people, the majority of white people, supported the present or their modern day fight for civil rights. And so the first time that happened. And then we quickly reverted back to most white people not supporting that fight. That is the norm in U.S. history, is most white people not supporting the fight for black liberation. And then even more, and then you have another percentage of those that so-called support the fight, supporting it on conditions, conditional support of liberation against white oppression, against a white supremacist society. And these same white people don't uphold those so-called conditions to their own communities. So really, if white folks don't want to be accused of being oppressors, then, well, you need to look at your own people. Documented history, empirical data don't support the internal recoil that some folks might have against such accusations. If you don't like it, do something about it. Don't complain to me. Quite frankly, I don't care. I guess sometimes you just have to get a backlog of thoughts off your chest as you look at the horizon. Because the state of this nation, quite frankly, scares me. I don't think white liberals and moderates are scared enough. But then again, when it comes to the threat of white supremacist violence in this country, they never have been. Because it doesn't really impact them at the level it impacts everybody else, but it does impact them. Police violence also impacts white people. But it's, police violence is at its root a cause of white supremacy. So we can end police violence across races. That's possible. But we have to address anti-blackness and racism and white supremacy in this country first. Quite frankly, it's comically absurd and really obscene to me. And all is. Critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, Black Power movement, Civil Rights movement. We're all and have all been accused of being nihilistic. Because they illuminate the pervasiveness of racism in this nation and how deep it is. All of these movements and ideas correctly have claimed and ID'd the pervasiveness of racism in this country and how deep it goes past its governing document. But none of them exclude the idea of possible paths forward. That's not nihilistic. But it has been, and it always will be, well-meaning white folks holding back progress. And this is part of where Black Power came from, because it just said, F white people, we don't need them. But the fact is, not necessarily that we need them. It's just that when black people attempt to self-govern, self-empower, self-liberate, the full boot of the state and this country's white populace stamps down on the neck of black people through a variety of different ways. Goes out of its way to destroy those organizations, such as the Black Panthers, that build up structures of self-governance, of community power, and more. And there's a specific word that I'm blanking out on right now, but and I'm for the idea of a multicultural democracy. But for it to function, it requires the liberation of black folks, because then it liberates all folks. But it's always well-meaning white folks holding back progress. Just Senator Manchin has come out against the For the People Act, modern day Voting Rights Act, basically, for, again, truly obscene reasons, wrong reasons, bad reasons, whatever you want them. And those that disagree with him won't fight him as hard as they need to. Not saying they won't fight at all, but as hard as they need to. They need to be down his neck. But that's not going to happen. American is a democracy on its deathbed. And the racism in its veins is what's killing it. Not enough white folks feel the urgency of now. I'm a little defeatist today. I don't know. I just don't know. And like I said, sometimes you just kind of need to speak into the ether and Get it off your chest. This thing's burning right now. This country is a burning house. And it's hanging on by a thread. And a lot of folks are pointing it out. But people ain't acting it like it's hanging on by a thread. Yeah, and I don't have a lot of words for uplift right now. But maybe next week. Maybe next week. Well, yeah. We'll call it. That's it for this week at Finding the One with Our Son. I'm Matthew Brogan, your host here at Masson365. You can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Hit subscribe. Do the 5-star thing. Share it out. Do that whole thing. Thanks for coming, folks. Hope you're managing the heat all right. And have yourselves a good week. Have a good week.
This is 365 Media.